Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alan McPherson, and I'm thrilled to be here talking about my book, Ghosts of Sheridan Circle, How a Washington Assassination Brought Pinochet's terrorist state to justice. First, let me say how grateful I am to the Grupo de Historia de Razones Internacionales for having hosted this event, and specifically to Francisco Rodríguez Jiménez for inviting me to speak about this. I'm a professor at Temple University in Philadelphia, so good afternoon if you're in the United States, good evening if you're in Europe, and welcome to everybody, no matter where you may be. This is my first time speaking on one of these Facebook Live things, and so hopefully everything's going to go well, technically speaking. I will be seeing your questions after I make a few remarks for about 20 minutes or so. They'll be coming on my phone, which is right here, and so once in a while I'll be. The book that I'm going to be, and it's about the assassination of Orlando Letelier, and so I'll explain who that is. It is a narrative nonfiction book. It is not the sort of typical academic book. It moves a lot faster and essentially reads like a political thriller. So if you're interested in something you can read while on vacation at the beach, please pick up a copy. So let me show you a little bit of the style of the writing by reading from the first few paragraphs. Isabel, I have a surprise for you. Have lunch with me. Well, today will be difficult. I have work. But you will love this surprise, Orlando Letelier insisted. Come and get me at 12:30 and leave your work for the afternoon. Isabel Letelier acceded. After all, her husband was a charmer. Besides, there was no time to argue. It was 9 a.m., time for Orlando to go to work at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C.'s DuPont Circle. He had been at the leftist think tank for nearly 2 years, using IPS as a platform to undermine General Augusto Pinochet, the iron-fisted dictator who had overthrown the government of President Salvador Allende of Chile. Letelier had been Allende's ambassador to the United States, then his minister with 3 portfolios. Now, as a private citizen, he exposed Pinochet's human rights atrocities, incited boycotts, and discouraged investment. 2 of Orlando's colleagues happened to ride with him that day, Michael and Ronnie Moffett, both 25 and recently married. The Moffetts waited while Letelier, ever tardy, showered and dressed, skipped breakfast, and rushed out the door. Isabel barely had time to kiss him goodbye. Orlando took the wheel of his 1975 Chevrolet Chevelle Malibu Classic. Out of gallantry, Michael opened the front passenger door for Ronnie. He plopped himself on the back seat. That September 21st, 1976, was a drizzly, misty morning in the nation's capital. In less than an hour, Orlando and Ronnie would be dead. Michael would be traumatized for life. So quickly, let me show you the car that was bombed, right? There was a bomb put under the driver's seat. And this is at Sheridan Circle in Washington, D.C. Here is Orlando Letelier, and this is Ronnie Moffett, and both were killed in the assassination. I never learned what the surprise was, Isabel recalled when I interviewed her over 40 years later. To this day, the killing of Orlando Letelier and Ronnie Moffett remains the only assassination of a foreign diplomat on U.S. soil. Also the only state-sponsored assassination ever in Washington, and the most important in U.S. history. Until Osama bin Laden, assessed one historian, the Letelier-Moffett assassinations constituted the most brazen act of international terrorism ever committed in the capital of the United States. It is still the only state-sponsored such act, and the only car bomb. The 2-decade-long resolution of this case would hold implications for Chile, the United States, terrorism, human rights, and the fate of democracy everywhere. My book notably argues that it would down the entire Pinochet government. But today I want to explore a sub-theme of the book. 2 opposing forces, fascism and human rights, that clashed during these decades and that outlived the communist capitalist ideological struggle of the Cold War. These forces are still with us today, and the Letelier assassination brought them into open conflict. The order to assassinate Letelier was not simply an overreaction by an anti-communist regime, although it was that. It was also rooted in the fascism that lurked inside post-war Latin America. In Chile, that fascism partly directly from Germany. In the 19th century, southern Chile attracted 30,000 settlers from the German states. A military mission from Prussia shaped up Chile's troops, resulting in the gray uniforms and the goose-stepping of the daunting Chilean army. In the 20th century, the mostly fair-skinned, well-to-do Germans of southern Chile filled the ranks of far-right parties. They cheered and marched when Hitler came to power. The Nazis of Chile boasted 60,000 members, electing 3 to the national legislature. In 1938, they attempted a failed putsch in Santiago. After World War II, southern communities became favorite destinations for former Nazi officers fleeing persecution. Throughout fascism in Chile, not only adhered to all of Nazi Germany, anti-Semitism, anti-communism, state control of the economy, hierarchical leadership, and intense nationalism, but also added its own, a love of all things Spain, the traditions of Catholicism, the rejection of empire, and the championing of Latin American unity made this among the most potent totalitarianisms in all of Latin America. Manuel Contreras, the head of the secret police who gave the order to kill Letelier, grew up in this Germanized south of Chile. After World War II, he admired the Spanish dictator Francisco Franco. When Pinochet and his allies overthrew Allende on September 11, 1973, Contreras was in on it. On September 10th, when his son fretted over an English exam the next day, Contreras looked at him and smiled. "Don't worry, you're not going to school tomorrow." Right after the coup, Pinochet made Contreras the head of the National Intelligence Directorate, known as DINA in Spanish. A colonel, Contreras now answered to no general, minister, or judge, only to Pinochet. DINA dominated all other intelligence agencies. Its 9,300 employees could raid homes and jail suspects without charges, and its 20 to 30,000 informants spread fear throughout other Chilean government agencies. Its logo featuring an iron glove, DINA was responsible for about 1,200 of the 3,200 under Pinochet. The associations between DINA and fascism were legion. It was alleged that its employees engaged in rituals harking back to bygone warrior myths, the use of runes, an ancient German alphabet, and the celebration of solstices and equinoxes to revive Nazism. DINA members addressed one another as pharaohs, priests, and slaves, denoting their status within the hierarchy. Contreras even allied with former Nazi Paul Schaefer of Colony of Dignity Infamy by using Schaefer's enclave as a detention and torture center. The US Department of Defense compared DINA to Hitler's Gestapo. When Franco died in 1975, Pinochet flew to Madrid for the funeral, and Contreras took a plane full of officers along. Franco supporters lined up on the avenue from the airport and gave the Chileans' motorcade the stiff-armed fascist salute. In my book, I call Contreras the Himmler of the Andes. Let me show you a picture from the book here that illustrates what happened to Orlando Letelier on September 11th. Oops, I'm sorry. Here he is, actually being taken prisoner by his own people. On that day, September 11th, Orlando Letelier served as Chile's Minister of Defense. When he showed up to his ministry after hearing rumors of a coup, plotters took him prisoner and shipped him to Dawson Island, a Nazi-style concentration camp in the deep frozen south of Chile. There and in other detention centers, he would remain for a year, never charged with crime, psychologically tortured and emaciated, until the Venezuelan government obtained his freedom. Before his release, Letelier was told in no uncertain words, "General Pinochet will not tolerate activities against his government." Still, Letelier ended up working against Pinochet in Washington. His work coincided with a golden age of human rights activism in the mid-1970s. More than 200 groups in the United States worked on human rights, over 50 lobbied Congress, and about 15 concentrated on Latin America. In Chile, Congress's greatest achievement was 1975's Harkin Amendment, which cut off aid to any government that grossly violated human rights, unless the president himself determined that such aid would directly benefit the needy. The following year, Teddy Kennedy, the senator, directly targeted Chile, marking the first time that Congress ended military aid to another government because of human rights. One Chilean magazine called Kennedy the most dangerous foreign adversary the Pinochet regime. Letelier, helped by Ronnie and Michael Moffat, worked in this environment at the Institute for Policy Studies, one of the most influential human rights organizations in the country. He met with top State Department officials, he taught at American University, he lunched with senators. Angela Davis once came to his house. Joan Baez was a friend of his. Richard Avedon photographed him. Most important, Letelier became a unifier for Chilean exiles, numbering in the hundreds of thousands worldwide. He also convinced Holland's Dock Workers Federation to boycott the handling of Chilean goods, and he won the cancellation of a planned $62 million mining investment. These two things, right, rallying Chileans abroad and cutting off investment to Chile, these two things seem to have convinced Pinochet to order Letelier's assassination. So roughly from 1975 to 1983, Contreras and his South American allies killed several hundred people outside of Chile. At looking away from such brutalities, National Security Advisor and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger became an expert. 1 month before Letelier was killed, his State Department prepared a memo signed by Kissinger that instructed Southern Cone ambassadors to express to South American dictators Washington's, quote, deep concern over their plans for the assassination of subversives, politicians, and prominent figures both within the national borders of certain Southern countries, Southern Cone, and abroad. So what this means is that Kissinger was telling his ambassadors to tell all of the dictators of South America, we know that not only are you killing people inside your countries, you're killing them outside of your countries. This is what was called Operation Condor. Basically, he was saying, cut it off, or cut it out. But for 1 month, none of the ambassadors carried out the order, which is something rare in diplomacy. Usually when the Secretary of State gives you an order, you follow through. The ambassador to Uruguay feared for his life if he wagged his finger at the generals. The envoy to Chile worried that Pinochet, quote, might well take it as an insult, any inference that he was connected with such assassination plots. 5 days before the Letelier assassination, Kissinger mysteriously ordered, quote, that no further action be taken on the matter. Back in Chile, this same summer of 1976, Contreras, the head of the secret police, acting through his chief of operations, Pedro Espinosa, entrusted the hit on Letelier to a man called Michael Townley, an American Chilean explosives expert. During the from 1970 to 1973, Townley worked with proto-fascist youth shock troops called Fatherland and Freedom, or Patria y Libertad. Recruits to Fatherland and Freedom received training in coding and code breaking, weapons handling, explosives, and martial arts. Leader Pablo Rodríguez would regularly line up his quote-unquote troops and review them with his right arm crossed against his chest. Remember, these are teenagers, right? They are not working for the government. They're not in the military. They wore black uniforms with white armbands adorned with a swastika-like insignia that united chain links and resembled a spider. Hitler's brown shirts, I think, would have approved. Allende's followers called Fatherland and Freedom a bunch of fascists paid by the CIA. And they were correct. Rodríguez denied accepting CIA funding, but the truth is that in fall 1970, Kissinger requested and received $38,000 for covert support of Fatherland and Freedom. Others in the group admitted receiving those funds and added that an extra $5,000 per month filtered in. Townley, the American-Chilean bomb maker, embraced the rhetoric and actions of Fatherland and Freedom. The masses are not ready to govern themselves, the American-Chilean once intoned. Democracy leads only to mass government ruled by the herd. Power should be reserved for the qualified few, the intellectuals, the philosopher kings. In the United States, Townley connected with about 5 Cuban Americans, also proto-fascists. They call themselves the Cuban Nationalist movement, headquartered in a New Jersey newly Cubanized since Fidel Castro's 1959 revolution. By the 1970s, these Cuban Americans were also disenchanted with the US government, which had dropped them as assets against Castro. Like Contreras, these Cubans had decided to kill opponents throughout the world. Soon bombs exploded in New York, Montreal, Miami, Lima, Mexico City, Merida, Kingston, Madrid, London, and Paris. Between 1974 and 1976, authorities tied 202 major bombings in 23 countries to Cuban exiles. That's 1 every 5 days on average, and 113 of them in the United States. In 1974, Cuban exiles accounted for 45% of all terrorist bombings on the planet. The CNM's motto, Cuba before all, recalled Nazi Germany's Deutschland über alles. Its pamphlets outlined an ideology centered on a syndicalist capitalism akin to those of Mussolini, Hitler, Franco, and Chile's fatherland and freedom. One Cuban member of a more mainstream organization dismissed the CNM as right-wing extremists and fascists. Still, these Cubans helped Townley build the car bomb and install it under Letelier's car. One Cuban drove behind him on the morning of September 21st, 1976, while another pushed the button on the detonator. So it's actually Cuban exiles who physically killed Orlando Letelier. For Washington and the policymakers there, the challenge of the Letelier assassination, such as Kissinger, who enabled fascism to infiltrate the Chilean government, those such as Teddy Kennedy, the senator, who championed human rights, and the vast majority in the middle, who needed the car bombing to prompt them to care enough. Early on, mainstream US observers tended towards absolving the Chilean regime. The New York Times' editors concluded that it's hard to believe that even as ham-handed a regime as Chile's junta would order the murder of so eminent an opponent as Mr. Letelier in the capital of the United States. The National Security Council, writing the day Chileans are the obvious candidates, but they seem to be too obvious. Thankfully, investigation was not up to the NSC, it was the job of the FBI and the Attorney General's office. And these men, led by Eugene Proper, were anti-communists, but also gifted technocrats, dedicated to solving the murder wherever it took them. For almost 18 months, the FBI had no solid lead. It heard of a mysterious gringo among Chileans, but had no name. Turns out this was Michael Townley. It heard rumors from Cuban Americans. A grand jury subpoenaed them, but they kept mum. And the investigation kept getting threats, just as Orlando and Isabel had before. If they can do this and get away with it under the nose of the CIA and the FBI, said President-elect Jimmy Carter in November 1976, so this is just after the assassination, then no president can govern. On one hand, Carter meant that such a brazen attack on a Chilean dissident on US soil was unacceptable to the US policymaking apparatus, whether Republican or Democrat. It made the United States look unable to police its own borders. It made the Cold War seem out of control. On the other hand, foreign policymakers were careful about pushing a Cold War ally too hard. A US political officer in Chile explained that we were not against the Chilean government, we were not against had been performed in its name. So it was up to Isabel Letelier, Michael Moffett, and human rights such as IPS to pressure Carter officials against the Chileans. First, to expel Townley, which proved successful, and second, to extradite Contreras and other Chileans, which proved a failure. When Pinochet traveled to Washington, Carter met him in the Oval Office and brought up human rights and his determination to get to the bottom of the Letelier crime. Pinochet nodded and promised cooperation. But my book reveals how, behind the scenes, the dictator orchestrated a cover-up. Letelier and Moffett were really aghast, and this is actually a picture of Isabel Letelier, Michael Moffett, and Senator Teddy Kennedy. So this is part of the lobbying they did to try to get justice in this case. So they were aghast at the fact that Pinochet was able to get to the Oval Office while essentially being investigated for an assassination in Washington. Moffett asked at a press conference, if Carter is serious about human rights, why doesn't he welcome Isabel and me just like he's welcoming Pinochet? Because he didn't want to meet the widower and the widow. So they wrote to the president for a meeting. But Zygmunt Brzezinski, the national security advisor, Brzezinski didn't help at all, Letelier told me. We could never get through to him, never. In her activism, Letelier focused attention on Pinochet's likely responsibility for the assassination. College and local newspapers covered her, as did local radio and television. So this was the Human Rights Network in action. When the right-wing media in the US tried to smear Orlando as a tool of Fidel Castro, Isabel debunked their lies. The dam finally burst when, in March 1978, investigators published photos of two men whose name they ignored, but whom they suspected of being involved. These turned out to be Townley and a man called Armando Fernandez of Chile. Within days, these people were, identified. American investigators in the FBI and American diplomats put a lot of pressure on the Chileans, who Michael Townley, since he was an American citizen. let me skip ahead a little bit here. So within weeks, Townley was stateside, spilling all the Chilean secrets on the assassination. He served about 3 years in U.S. prisons and is likely now still living in the witness protection program. 3 Cuban Americans were also tried, but their guilty verdicts were soon after thrown out on technicality. The champions of human rights had a limited victory by getting Townley, but Pinochet remained in power, and Contreras, though demoted, remained free. The Chilean courts refused to extradite him, Espinosa, and Fernandez, the man in the photo. My book is the first to recount what happened over the next 15 years, and I'll go through it very quickly. After about 1980, the story shifted to Chile, where fascists and human rights champions remained in conflict. Isabel Letelier and her family kept the legal case technically alive against Contreras, Espinosa, and Fernandez, but held out little hope of an actual trial. In the United States, the Reagan government repealed Carter's already weak sanctions. Crucially, however, Democrats in Congress forced the executive to quote-unquote certify that Chile was making progress on the Letelier-Moffat case in order to allow military-to-military relations. And therefore, throughout the 1980s, Reagan could never normalize relations with Pinochet, no matter how much he wanted to, because the Congress didn't allow him to do so unless he resolved the Letelier case. It took a few breaks in the late 1980s and early 1990s to reinvigorate this case. The first break was the defection in 1987 of Armando Fernandez, who had surveilled Letelier in Washington. For the first time, American officials heard all the details about Pinochet's orchestration of the coup. Fernandez ended up spending only 21 months in Chilean hospitals and U.S. prisons, but it was the first conviction of a Chilean military man in U.S. courts. It also seems to conclude that Pinochet not only covered up the crime, but also ordered the hit. And this conclusion, that the CIA had decided in the 80s that Pinochet had ordered the hit, only came to light in 2015, after I started writing this book. In 1990, another learned Fernandez's story. Monica Lagos, a former dancer and later an escort for Dina, had accompanied Fernandez to act as his wife under the pseudonym Liliana Walker. She had disappeared from everywhere much of the 1980s, debilitating alcoholism, drug addiction, and schizophrenia. On April 17th, Chileans awoke to a dramatic front-page headline in that morning's La Época newspaper, and here it is. So that morning, that's what it said. Liliana Walker had been this mysterious woman. And now they saw a 1976 passport photo of her. And at this point, the Reagan and Bush governments had turned against Pinochet. The Democratic opposition in Chile led the way. The press felt free to criticize the regime. And as a result, Pinochet lost a referendum on his rule. In early 1990, a new Democratic government was in power. And that's when a German, Monica Lagos. The Fernandez and Lagos confessions, the Letelier case could now be reopened in Chilean courts. 3 years later, they found Contreras and Espinosa guilty. In 1995, the Supreme Court ratified the decisions. Contreras spent the rest of his life in detention until he died in 2015. Espinosa, as far as I know, is still in prison. The Letelier affair stands as one of the most consequential assassinations of the Cold War. In Chile, the quest for justice brought about the dissolution of Dina and eventually defanged the country's amnesty law, which prevented the prosecution of Pinochet-era atrocities. It forced the Reagan government to put decisive diplomatic and financial pressure on the dictatorship. Contreras and Espinosa were the first of Pinochet's military officers to go to prison and among the first Cold War violators of human rights in Latin America or anywhere to do so. The case sparked a movement that has adjudicated more than 1,000 cases of human rights violations in Chile alone. The Letelier assassination, in retrospect, was one of the more stupid things done by any government, said one U.S. diplomat. That certainly is true. Pinochet, Contreras, and Townley did not understand the implications of car bombing a former ambassador and a U.S. citizen in the heart of Washington. It took decades, but their monstrous deed backfired, contributing in no small part to ending their ideological dream, their government, and in the last 2 cases, their personal freedom. All these the results of a movement of human rights activists who correctly identified the fascist core of the Pinochet regime. Thank you very much for listening. Let me see if there are any questions here. People have been free to put questions since the beginning. I'm just waiting to see if anything is coming through here. I'm going to give it a minute or so. Okay. A direct agent of the CIA, or did he play as a sort of autonomous role in coordination with Díaz? You know, one never knows for absolutely certain whether somebody is working for. Evidence points to the fact that he is not, right? We certainly have no evidence that he was. In fact, we know that he wanted to work with the CIA. In fact, he showed up at the door of the embassy. He wanted to be sort of an informant for the US Embassy in Chile, and they said no. He wanted to work for the CIA. They also said no. We do know that Contreras, the head of Díaz, was paid a one-time fee to inform the CIA about things that, inside Chile, and then the CIA said, we really don't want to be associated with this man. Now, Contreras, once he was accused of this crime, said several times in Chilean courts and to any newspaper reporter who would interview him that he didn't do it and Díaz didn't do it. It was the CIA that did it through Townley. And so the myth that Townley is somehow connected to the CIA might come from essentially this lie that Contreras told over and over again to the Chilean press. He never presented any kind of evidence to back up that claim. And so what Townley was really was an employee of Díaz, right, of the secret police of Chile. He didn't join Díaz until I think about 1974, a little bit into the regime, right? The regime begins in September 1973. And Townley has been, before the coup, autonomous in the sense that he's basically an electronics repairman. He doesn't have much money at all. But in the years of Allende, he gets into, he starts working with Fatherland and Freedom. They're not paying him anything. He just sort of is making Molotov cocktails for them, and he does, a couple of missions here and there. And so once Díaz takes it, they say, okay, this guy could be very useful. Not only can he make bombs and detonate them at a distance, he can travel all over the world, and he's an American citizen. He speaks English. He can go to the United States, get the equipment he needs, meet with Cuban Americans who are in the United States. And so he's got all the attributes it takes for him to organize a coup, not a coup, but an assassination like Letelier's. And by the way, he's responsible for several other assassinations, although he's never been tried for them because he's under the protection of the Witness Protection Program in the United States. So if that program works well, he will probably always stay in the United States and die in the United States. At this point, about 75 years old, so he may not have long to live. He may already be dead and we wouldn't know it. Okay, another great question. What was the role of US think tank in promoting the case of Letelier? I'm not sure which think tank this relates to, but I'm guessing IPS, the Institute for Policy Studies. It was very important, right? I mean, if we have sort of kept the memory of not only Letelier, but of Ronnie Moffett alive, it's because of IPS. Near, in the circle itself, if you actually go there one day, if you're near Sheridan Circle, go take a walk there, and you will see a sort of a plaque, I think it's called a medallion that's raised from the ground, and it has a picture. In fact, I have a picture of Isabelle Letelier looking at this medallion on the back of the book. This is in Sheridan Circle, and it's IPS that put it there in, I think, the 1990s, maybe the mid-1980s. They've also set up, more importantly, the Letelier Moffett Human Rights Award that's given every year to a couple of human rights groups. And so if anybody wants to make donations to that organization, it's a very worthwhile one. It encourages people to embrace human rights and to work for human rights. And so just attaching that name to that award has kept the memory of these two people alive. Both of them worked for IPS. Ronnie Moffat was sort of a more junior person. She was essentially a fundraiser. She had started as kind of a secretary, had risen to be a fundraiser. And Michael Moffat, her husband, who is still alive, I think, was working actually more closely with Letelier, and so they were all colleagues together. And the couple, the Moffats, just happened to ride in his car on that day. So it was sort of an unfortunate coincidence that they were in it. And in fact, she really, Michael Moffat was in the back seat, which is why he didn't get killed. And she really should not have gotten killed because the bomb was under the driver's seat. It easily killed Letelier, but unfortunately she caught a bit of shrapnel in her throat. It opened up an artery, and she basically choked to death because of that. But with a little bit more luck, she could have gotten out of there alive. And both were only 25 years old, and they weren't targeted by the Chilean regime. The Chileans, in fact, had told Michael Townley, "He'll be in the car when you set it off." But he gave the job to the Cubans, and the Cubans didn't care whether there was anybody else in the car. If you have questions about the Cubans, I'm happy to answer those, because that's a whole other book somebody could write about them. Okay, we do have a third question. What was the reaction among European governments? Was the terrorist attack a backlash for anti-Pinochet movements across the world, or conversely, it served as a glue? That's a good question. Michael Townley and people similar to him, people, hired by Dina and operating what was called Operation Condor, were also operating in Europe. They tried to assassinate another Chilean exile in Rome, which I think was 1974. I think Michael Townley was also somehow related to the assassination of Olof Palme. And so there were worries, right? And bombs that were tied to the Cubans were also going off in European cities. And so both of these groups, the Chileans and the Cubans, when I say Cubans, I mean the Cuban Americans, not the Castro Cubans. Both of them had decided around the same time that they should try to target their enemies, not just anywhere in the world, and therefore nobody was really safe. It was a backlash, but not against European anti-Pinochet movements. What the fear was among Pinochet and others was that people like Letelier were charming, even though they were communists. Letelier was really a peaceful communist along the lines of Allende. He wanted communists to win through elections and to develop a pluralist political system. And so he was also a diplomat. He had lived in the United States for a long time, so he was very cosmopolitan. And so he was charming to people who were anti-Pinochet but not communist, right? The Christian Democrats, for instance. And so he certainly had the potential to bring a lot of these opposition groups together. But it wasn't his plan to create a government in exile, although that was exactly what Pinochet was afraid of. That the Chilean exiles, who were about 500,000 people by the mid-1970s, he figured they're forming government in exile, are in Chile, they're going to try to overthrow us, and then sort of the diplomats will come back and they're going to try to once I'm gone, and they're going to be duped by the communists all over again, and I can't let that happen, right? So to him, this is a conspiracy. He organized a conspiracy against it, which is Operation Condor. But it turns out there really is no conspiracy. There's just sort of vague collaboration by communist and non-communist anti-Pinochet Chileans. And they have some allies, obviously, among Europeans, but mostly it's just people who are maybe sending them a little bit of money, getting their message out, and that sort of thing, but they're not scheming in any way. Francisco, let me know if we should just end, but if not, I'll just stay here and keep taking. And let me see if I can show some more photos. Oh, good question. Yes, I should talk about this. Were you able to access Chilean sources, or are most of them American ones? And which are, in your opinion, questions to be solved, if any? Okay, three questions, really. Most sources are American sources, but I did get access to, and I did go to Chile and get access to sources. What I did was look at I got a couple of documents from the Foreign Ministry of Chile. Most of what I got were documents from the Letelier family collection, which is in Santiago. So letters they wrote to each other. For instance, Orlando was in so he wrote to his family wrote back, and some of these letters are really touching, and many of them are quoted in the book. There's lots of photos there that are very helpful. So you get a really good sense of them as a family. I also interviewed some of them. I went to Santiago and interviewed the widow, Isabel Letelier. I interviewed, in fact, two of her sons, but in the United States. I interviewed other friends of his or of them in Santiago. And so interviews, primary research. I also read, but this I did back in Washington, D.C., thousands of magazine and newspaper articles from Chile. So the big sort of news magazines and newspapers from the 70s to the 90s, and they all covered this. And interestingly, it was interesting to see how much they would cover it when it came out, because at first, when it happens, they're not particularly interested in it, and the press is very much self-censoring, right? They know what they can and cannot publish. Once the case gets uncovered in 1978 and the name of Michael Townley comes out, and then the FBI is putting that on the front pages of Washington newspapers, then the press in Chile starts saying, well, we can cover this as much as we want now because it's an American story, right? We're covering a crime that happened in America, but it's of interest to our readers, and it's going to sell newspapers. And so one of the many ways in which the Letelier crime opened up Chilean society and sort of signaled the beginning of the end of the Pinochet regime was through this opening of the press, right? It's the first crime of the Pinochet regime that the press started talking about and covering pretty honestly, even though editorial writers were essentially saying, oh, this can't possibly be Chile, right? This must be the Chilean left that is trying to blame this thing on Pinochet, and they're killing one of their own, that sort of thing. But they covered essentially all of the facts of the trials. Most of the documents, like I said, are really to be found in the United States. Peter Kornblue, who's a historian and a researcher, he's written books about Pinochet. In the 1980s, there was one case against Contreras and Pinochet that was a civil case, and for that, they gathered dozens of boxes of documents from the Attorney General's office, from the FBI, and so there's a whole collection at a university in Washington, D.C. that covers all of the sort of internal investigation in the United States. So it's really fascinating. And so I did other interviews in the United States. I did research, from Wisconsin to California, all over the place. There's all sorts of sources. So it was a fascinating thing to research and to write. Now, are there still any mysteries? Not big ones, I would say. One is that we don't have a lot of documents from the CIA, right? The FBI itself didn't get much cooperation from the CIA during the investigation. Now, it's not the CIA's job to solve this. This is a crime that happens in the United States, and so it's an FBI jurisdiction. But the CIA wasn't particularly forthcoming, and the FBI was afraid that if they asked too much of the CIA would tell the Chileans, who were their friends essentially, not to cooperate with the FBI, or they would burn bridges for them in all sorts of ways. They didn't want to give a lot of information to the CIA, also because they were afraid the CIA would give that information pass it along to the Chileans, to Contreras. We don't really know if they would have done that or not. The one mystery I'd like to solve, which I think could be solved, is of that 1980s memo. So in 2015, 2016, we got two documents from long ago, from the 80s. One of them was the Secretary of State, George Shultz, writing to President Reagan saying, the CIA has now made a determination that Pinochet is directly tied to this, right? Not only did he try to cover it up, but he gave the order to Contreras, who gave it to Espinosa, who gave it to Michael Townley, right? And so it sort of told us that, the United States government had come to that realization at that time. In 2016, we got the actual letter or the report from the CIA, but a lot of it is blacked out. And so while the CIA does repeat the basic findings, it doesn't say why it thinks that that Pinochet ordered the hit. And so I'd like to know that. I mean, I have a suspicion why they think that. I think they think it because of what everybody knew. But if they have some specific information, it'd be great to have it. Now, those documents in 2015, 2016 came out when the Obama government was, visiting Chile, or the Chileans were visiting here, and they basically did them a favor by, releasing hundreds and hundreds of documents. So I think it's mostly CIA stuff that we'd love to know more about. On the Chilean side, of course, there's plenty of information that's somewhat missing. I mean, it's frustrating because Contreras never admitted that he even gave the order, even though it was quite obvious that no order would have gone out without him at least agreeing on it. He certainly would not have disagreed with an order, even if he got it from Pinochet. But overall, I think this can stand as the definitive, word on the case, because after 2015, 2016, essentially, I think historians had combed through, right, and people in the State Department had combed through all their documents and said, this is what we've got, right? These are all the documents we now have. Okay, what do we think, Francisco? Should we end it there, or should we do another question? Oh, okay. Okay, is this a controversial topic in Chile still today? I don't particularly think so. I mean, it was controversial in the early 1990s when Pinochet was no longer the dictator, but he was head of the army. Then he was a senator for life who couldn't be tried for anything, right? He had sort of immunity. A lot of Chileans simply wanted to forget about the past. They wanted to think of Pinochet as somebody who had saved the nation from communism, and then stepped down peacefully after elections, refused him in 1989. This was sort of their narrative, and so the Letelier case didn't fit comfortably within this, and a lot of people simply didn't believe that Pinochet or Contreras was the one really being tried with Espinosa, that they were involved in this. But by the time that they were tried and the people saw the evidence, it was actually the first trial ever put on live television as it was happening. And so for several days, people saw this in the mid-1990s. People saw this on TV. They saw the evidence. And it was lots of evidence. By the time that they're found guilty, the majority of Chileans believe that Contreras and Espinosa were in on it and planned the whole thing. Doesn't mean that they gave up their sort of love of Pinochet that continued well into his trial in the 2000s. And obviously there are some conservatives in Chile who are still pro-Pinochet. In fact, I remember, I think on one website, there's sometimes readers who will give their opinion of the book at the bottom of the page. And one person said, "Oh, great book, really well written, really entertaining, and so on. But the guy's a little hard on Pinochet." Basically saying, well, Pinochet saved the economy, so on and so forth. And of course, my book is not about the economy. It's about this one crime. And so it's really hard to defend Pinochet on this crime. And so there are some holdouts, but I don't see that this is particularly controversial in Chile. So I think this will be it. Let me just make sure I'm doing everything right here at the end. Thank you very much, everyone. I'm going to end the video in just a second. Thank you so much for the questions. The book is published by the University of North Carolina Press. Let me show you the title once more. Ghost of Sheridan Circle, How Washington Assassination Brought Pinochet's Terrorist State to Justice. Those of you who get it, hope you enjoy it. Thank you so much for listening.